But our next guest has a few things to add to this. She is a former television anchor herself, the 2022 Republican nominee for governor of Arizona and senior advisor to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which oversees Voice of America. Kari Lake joins us in an unofficial capacity. Kari, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. I've been watching that story very closely over the past few days, and I find it rather interesting.
Well, talk to us about it. Why? My first reaction to all of this, when I read the letter, I did not see it as a threat to First Amendment rights. I mean, it just seemed like it was a standard kind of, hey, you have to abide by Pentagon rules if you want to report out of the Pentagon. So I did not see anything alarming about that, per se. And I remembered my White House days covering the White House. And some of the requirements laid out in this new letter include you cannot walk around the Pentagon willy-nilly like we used to, I guess. But that's the case for the White House. You're not allowed to just wander around the White House as a reporter. You're supposed to be escorted. So I was somewhat surprised at some of the things that were actually not in place before now.
It is amazing. I think willy-nilly is the perfect way to put it, that people were able to walk around the halls of the Pentagon without an escort, without even having to wear their press badge. I mean, they were getting away with that and then coercing people to give them information that is not for the public. Now, I'm all about investigative reporting. And if somebody decides on their own to betray their job and the oath and give a reporter information, they should be doing that off site, not at the Pentagon. And we shouldn't have reporters trying to coerce people at the Pentagon to break the law. I think that's over the top. And it's over the top because it could harm what's good for the public. I mean, we're talking about situations with the Pentagon where we're talking about war, strategy, things that really we need to be very careful about so that we don't harm our men and women in uniform. And so I think it's absolutely Pete Hegseth, the secretary of the Department of War, is in his rights to put this out and say, are you willing to follow the rules of the Pentagon? You don't just get to wander around here. Just like you said at the White House, you don't just get to wander around the White House. And you have to follow some of the basic rules. You can still do reporting. And I think that what we're seeing in this mass exodus of people walking out is a lot of people in the fake news don't want to do just honest reporting on what's happening at the Pentagon and the Department of War. They only want to do stories that are going to be stories about leaks or getting classified information or information that should not be out to the public, out to the public.
And in a way, that is the bread and butter of news and news gathering. But when it comes to the Pentagon, that's always been a very sensitive issue, one that has been contested in courts, one that has been contested in society. Like, you know, if we're going to actually report, but those reports actually put American lives in danger, that's been a line that we've been willing to draw in past as a society. In this particular case, though, it seems like we're in a completely different age, Kari, where 10, 15 years ago, a mass press walkout would have been something that the administration would fear. But now, a mass press walkout is something that's actually cheered, and they are replaced very easily by independent media.
Absolutely. Independent media who do want to cover important stories, and covering the Pentagon is of utmost importance, and covering what is happening, especially as we have so much happening around the globe. And we've got focus right now coming into focus is what's happening in Venezuela and the Caribbean. That these reporters would walk out and say, we're not going to cover that, is pretty astounding. And believe me, I'm a lifelong journalist. I am all about covering the story. And if you have somebody who wants to give you a tip on something and you want to dig into something, but to be roaming around the Pentagon trying to coerce people into breaking the law, I think that goes above and beyond. It goes beyond, it's beyond the pale. If somebody wants to do that, they can do that outside the Pentagon on their own time. And if they choose to break the law with confidential information, they will face the consequences of that. But, I think this just goes to show you that many of these so-called journalists aren't interested in really covering what's happening at the Pentagon. They're interested in trying to embarrass the administration or only do stories that are hit pieces and that they can then attribute to unnamed sources.
And that's always been the problem with the current media and the Trump administration under the first term and into this term. It's a very different environment, though. We don't have nearly as many leaks coming out of the Trump administration as we did the first time around. I believe that can be attributed to just stronger leadership. The Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, is attributed to being someone who is able to keep all of that together across the administration. Yeah. But again, it raises this, and this is why it's so important. I wanted your insight on this because from a media perspective, it's always been kind of this fundamental belief that the media is supposed to hold government to account. But we've seen how the media today, at least this newer generation, seems far more willing to push an agenda than to actually follow a story. So that's where the line becomes much blurrier about whether or not this is about media holding power to account or whether this is really about the media being foiled in their agenda.
Well, I think the question to ask there is these same folks in the media who walked out, were they trying to hold the last administration's Department at the time of Defense, now it's the Department of War, were they trying to hold those people accountable? Because I don't remember that. I remember when President Trump took the oath of office, the attack pieces came out anyway to try to discredit President Trump and the people he's chosen to lead these departments and these agencies. It's just been a nonstop. Same thing we saw in the first term of President Trump, but even ramped up more. Where were they when Joe Biden's Secretary of Defense was MIA? Was apparently in the hospital and gone. I mean, they were not covering that. They were not covering it critically. And those are stories you can cover from inside. If that happened to Pete Hegseth, I guarantee you, that's OAN right. And all of the reporters who are there would cover it, right? That's a legitimate story. What we don't want to see happening is them breaking the law at the Pentagon and not having any restrictions on where they can go. I've been to the Pentagon. I am an employee of the federal government. I was escorted when I was at the Pentagon. And so this is not something, they should not be getting that kind of access at a place like the Pentagon where we have serious issues with if there's leaking that could harm our men and women in uniform. I think that would be one of the worst things, or possibly tip off one of our adversaries and actually cause more harm.
Such an important point that you bring up the contrast between this Pentagon press corps and its handling and coverage of the Biden Pentagon and how they're covering now. I think that is end of conversation almost. There were so many stories that they could have covered that they just went along with the administration, refusing to hold them to account. And very important point, and it's probably why you now see that this poll after poll after poll, including this recent Gallup poll, saying something like 30% of Americans do not trust the media to report anything fairly. And I think that's just the reality of our culture today.
The media is almost as unpopular as Congress. I think they kind of fight for the last place in popularity with the American public. But, I just, while you were talking, Chanel, I remembered your coverage as a journalist during the first Trump administration and going into, obviously OAN was attacked because you guys were telling the truth. You were telling the truth about the laptop. You were telling the truth about what happened in Ukraine leading up to the first Trump or the second Trump impeachment, the hoax of an impeachment. And that was the doings and business doings of the Bidens in Ukraine. Now, why weren't these people who were so outraged that they have to wear media credentials and be escorted through the Pentagon, why weren't they covering that? because that ended up leading to a war.
They weren't.
Hundreds of billions of dollars were covered. Thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives were lost. And there's been no coverage as to what led up to all of that. And so I hope these so-called journalists, I really doubt they're journalists, they're just they're people who want to actually hurt and undermine the Trump administration and undermine America. I really wonder what their motives, their true motives are, because they weren't willing to cover some of the most important stories that could have prevented us from going into a war.